take it Australia is a nice country and you don't have cities go bankrupt there because you very badly misunderstand why cities go bankrupt. I want to bring you 5 points of extension. The first is about why cities go bankrupt and why that means we win the round because they have literally no legs to stand on in terms of the law. So what Chris tells us is that the reason cities go bankrupt is because of horrible, horrible mismanagement on the part of short-term interested politicians. So I think that to some degree this does contribute to cities going bankrupt. But recognize that there are a number of systemic factors that also cause cities to go bankrupt and that create a narrative that in fact means that bailouts generally happen when they should or that some sort of concession happens when it should and the city recovers in the long run without having to be sold to a corporate actor. There'll be a bunch of horrible things I'll talk about in my other points. So what are the structural imbalances? Well, the big structural imbalance is that the city provides things that it doesn't receive revenue for. First, it provides public goods. For example, an agglomeration of people and an agglomeration of things like communication technologies and transportation that allows industry to flourish and provides jobs to people outside the city. And second, it provides benefits to things, it supports, underwrites things that actually benefit people who live outside the city. So for example, cities like Detroit, in order to function, have to subsidize things like subways coming in from the suburbs so that they can continue to attract employers to their city. So I think that what happens when a city goes bankrupt is the city is providing more services than it's receiving revenue for because it's hard to collect revenue from people who live outside the city. That's like the whole point of this case, right? Like you can collect revenue from those who live in the city. This is the premise of the debate we're having. And so they're providing these services, they're not getting a lot of money, there's a financial crisis, so people have money, and probably it's the case, like it is the case in Detroit, that a lot of rich people are also living in the city. So I think at this point, it's actually been pretty easy if you look at the one historical example that I think anybody is probably going to name in this round of a city going bankrupt in the past. New York City. What New York City did was say, look at all the systemic factors that caused us to go bankrupt. It's very clear that if you bail us out, this happened in the mid-1970s, if you bail us out, this won't happen again. And New York State was like, yeah, like without New York City, we'd just be the Borscht Belt. That would probably be a pretty terrible state to live in, and they bailed out the city, right? So I think that we actually don't have to worry about the harms either of these guys claim. I think in terms of front half harms, that everybody's going to lose their pension, everybody's going to lose their jobs. What will actually happen is that there will be some bailout that won't be true. And you guys also love the free market, right? Like it's the case that like lots of city employees are unionized and are getting way more money than they should. It's probably the case that some of them should lose their jobs, some of them should lose their pensions. But in terms of Wudc's whole extension about how the politicians will never fix the problem, the point is that the elected politicians in the city are ineffective and do have perverse incentives, but they're not the ones who are charged with fixing the problem because they have to go negotiate with the state, with the province, or with the federal government in order to get bailout money, and they are extremely constrained in all the things they can do, and we say those actors are generally very good actors. We've seen that historically. No, thank you. That's it for the things I want to talk about. The first is principle. So first I'll tell you there's an inalienable right to vote or to have some sort of representation in your government, an inalienable right to consent. And the warrant they give for this is social services. I think there are two other more important points. The first is that cities have policing power, and the second is that they have taking power. They can use things like eminent domain or police seizure to take your property away from you, and the police force can actually use violence against you, actually can lock you up for a prolonged period of time. So I don't think any government can ever have a perfect consent, but I think governments that have policing power and taking power have an obligation to maximize consent. There are two ways a democratic society can get consent. Provide a plurality of places in which you can live under different laws and allow you to vote on the laws under which you live. Now, they're getting rid of voting in this House, they can see that. And I think they're in a double bind in terms of the poor's ability to vote. Because I think there are two different kinds of poor people who might live in the city. Those who have jobs, which means they're part of the very small group of urban poor who have jobs and certainly aren't going to want to give those jobs and leave the city, or those who don't have jobs, which means an incredibly expensive move to another city is probably not feasible. So I think that while some poor people will be able to leave, a lot of poor people won't be able to leave, and they'll be living in a corporate tyranny. We think that's just unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. We just don't think you can do that to people in a democratic society. I'll take over.
Okay, so we gave you lots of reasons about why these companies have an incentive not to make it some hideous tyranny that you try and claim. Can you engage with that material?
Yeah, sure. So the reason they don't have an incentive not to make it a hideous tyranny for the poor is that the poor don't pay taxes and they do consume services, and your profit as the company that owns this city is services, or is taxes less services. There's the answer. So I want to talk about three things now in terms of the positive harms this will create. Because I think we've gotten a very bad characterization of the incentives these companies set. They tell us they just have one incentive, which is to cause economic development. I think they have three. First, I think they have an incentive to cause cities to collapse beforehand because there's a very serious arbitrage opportunity in certain specific circumstances. Imagine a city like Detroit where the primary employer is GM, or a city like Wichita where the primary employer is Boeing. Like in Wichita, Boeing actually employs like more than 50% of the population. So in many cases, these corporations have somewhat adversarial relationships with the city government because the city government is largely controlled by the unions that represent their workers. So what happens now is, no thank you, these cities lose a tremendous degree of power because there's a credible threat of layoffs leading to the city going bankrupt because people don't have revenue to pay their taxes. Here's how this would work, right? If you are the primary employer in a city, you're the only company that can save this city financially. So if the city goes bankrupt, you're the only company that's going to bid because you're the only one that can go, oh, we're going to hire back all our workers now. We don't have to build a whole bunch of completely new factories. So literally, by shutting down factories for like 6 months, you can then claim the right to like 25 years worth of your workers' wages by taking their tax revenues. I think insofar as that's true, you are actually going to have some companies just try to arbitrage control of their city. And I also think it's the case that even if that's not true, you make these companies much more powerful in terms of the demands they can place on the city. Now, they tell us that politicians have short-term incentives and also do shitty things. Like, this is true, right? But being a mayor is a pretty terrible job. Most mayors are pretty politically ambitious. And the mayor of Detroit's not ever going to get elected for anything again. I'm pretty damn sure about that. So insofar as that's the case, I think there's still much more out there. The second harm we got a lot about out of first opposition is this idea of long-term gentrification. So I just want to point out that, first of all, it's not the case, as First Up tells us, that there is like state or federal law that requires you to do all sorts of things to help provide the poor. It's like welfare payments are generally provided by the federal government. But things like public transportation, things like good public schools in poor areas, things like public housing, you generally have to apply for, pursue funding for as a city. You have no incentive to do that on their side of the house because you're still going to have to underwrite these things to some degree, and they don't bring wealthy people who pay taxes into your city. But the final thing I want to talk about is the horrible thing that happens when there's 4 years left. Because when there's 4 years left under contract, your incentive is just to extract as much money from the city as possible, which means you're going to dramatically decrease the quality of schools, decrease the quality of services, and dramatically increase taxes, which means you create exactly the same effect that causes cities to go bankrupt in the first place. Cities go bankrupt because the rich leave during economic downturn, because cities have problems like crime, because cities have problems like bad schools. On their side of the house, you just restart the horrible cycle that we had, also condemn a bunch of people to live under corporate tyranny, and also collapse the social safety net that cities should provide and only should provide.